She designed the perfect psychological trap to break an unbreakable human. But what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? And why did Captain Monroe leave behind a message that would change everything she thought she knew about manipulation? This is the story of how humanity's greatest weakness became their most dangerous strength. In the cold depths of space aboard the hegemony cruiser, Vindication Commander Saria Vel stood before a room full of the galaxy's most elite military minds. Her pale blue skin gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and those piercing silver eyes that had dissected 1,000 battle plans now swept across the assembled officers. She was known throughout the sector as the Architect, 3 steps ahead of every enemy, never surprised, never outmaneuvered. In 12 years of active command, she had never lost a single engagement. But today, something was different. Today, she looked troubled. "Gentlemen," her voice cut through the silence like a blade, "we have a problem." The holographic display behind her flickered to life, showing casualty reports from the Kepler front. Red numbers. Devastating red numbers. The Third Fleet, gone. The Seventh Armada, scattered. 6 months of tactical superiority, erased. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. By humans. A murmur rippled through the room. Humans, the newest species to stumble into galactic politics. Barely 2 centuries of spaceflight, primitive technology, no psychic abilities, no advanced biotechnology, just flesh and metal and stubbornness. Saria's fingers danced across the control panel. Battle footage began to play, ships exploding, formations breaking, orders collapsing into chaos. "Look at this," she commanded. "Battle of Proxima Station. We had them outnumbered 3-1. Superior firepower, better positioning, every tactical advantage you could imagine." The footage showed human ships making impossible maneuvers, ramming into hegemony vessels, coordinating in ways that defied every military textbook. They should have surrendered. They should have retreated. Instead, the room watched in stunned silence as human fighters threw themselves into hegemony formations with reckless abandon, turning certain defeat into Pyrrhic victory. "They're erratic," Saria continued, her voice growing sharper. "They're emotional. They make decisions based on feelings rather than logic. They sacrifice strategic positions for sentimental reasons." She turned to face her audience directly. "And that, my fellow commanders, makes them the most dangerous enemy we've ever faced." General Korthak, a veteran of 30 campaigns, shifted uncomfortably. "Commander, surely you're not suggesting that chaos and irrationality are military advantages." Saria's smile was cold as winter on Arcturus. "I'm suggesting that predictable enemies are manageable enemies. When you can calculate every possible move, you can counter every possible strategy. But humans," she gestured at the still-playing footage, "how do you plan against an enemy that doesn't plan? How do you outthink someone who acts on instinct?" The room fell silent again. These were military minds trained to see patterns, to anticipate movements, to think in terms of logical sequences. The idea of an enemy that operated outside those parameters was unsettling. "But here's what I've learned," Saria said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean forward. "Every species has a weakness. Every behavior pattern has a flaw. And humans, for all their unpredictability, have one critical vulnerability." She paused for effect, watching as every eye in the room focused on her with laser intensity. "They care too much." The hologram shifted, showing psychological profiles, cultural analysis, intercepted communications, images of human families, human children, human ceremonies honoring their dead. They form emotional attachments that override logical thinking. They'll sacrifice strategic advantages to save a single individual. They'll risk entire fleets to honor abstract concepts like loyalty or justice. Saria's voice grew more confident with each word. "Their greatest strength is also their greatest weakness." Commander Thess, head of Intelligence Division, leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" Saria's smile widened, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked like the architect they all knew. Confident, calculating, 3 steps ahead. "I'm proposing we stop trying to outfight them. Instead, we're going to outfeel them." The room erupted in confused murmurs, but Saria raised her hand for silence. We're going to give them exactly what they can't resist: a human in distress, a moral dilemma, an emotional trap so perfectly crafted that their bleeding hearts will walk them straight into our hands. She gestured to a new image on the hologram: a human male military bearing sharp green eyes. Meet Captain Calvin Monroe, Special Forces, a decorated veteran, and according to our intelligence, completely incorruptible. He's our test subject. Shiram. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. I'm going to prove that human emotional attachment can be weaponized, that their precious bonds of trust and loyalty are nothing more than exploitable weaknesses. Sarya's eyes glittered with something that might have been anticipation. I'm going to build the perfect psychological trap, and Captain Monroe is going to walk right into it. She turned back to the hologram, but not before adding, almost as an afterthought, after all, how hard can it be to manipulate a species that leads with their hearts instead of their heads? In the depths of space, Commander Sarya Vel was about to discover that some questions are more dangerous than the answers they reveal. 3 sectors away in the cramped quarters of the UES Defiance, Captain Calvin Monroe sat alone in the darkness, staring at a photograph that had traveled 30,000 light-years from Earth. The picture was worn at the edges, creased from years of careful folding and unfolding. It showed a young woman with Cal's same green eyes, wearing a medical corps uniform, her arm around a group of alien children on some distant relief station. His sister, Emma, dead now for 3 years. Cal's fingers traced the edge of the photo before sliding it back into his breast pocket right over his heart. Same ritual every night before sleep. Some habits he'd learned were worth keeping. At 34, Calvin Monroe was everything the Human Defense Corps wanted in a special operations commander. 6'2" lean muscle carved by years of zero-G combat training and real warfare. His service record read like a textbook on military excellence. 18 successful deep space missions, 0 disciplinary actions, 0 compromises of classified information, 0 failures of command. But those numbers didn't tell the whole story. The whole story was written in the scars on his hands from digging survivors out of wreckage when retreat was the logical option. It was written in the commendations he'd turned down because accepting them felt wrong when good people had died under his watch. It was written in the way his men would follow him into a black hole if he asked, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him completely. Captain Monroe had a reputation in the Corps. Unbreakable, they called him. Not because he was physically invincible, but because he had never not once been turned. Enemy interrogation, psychological warfare, bribery, blackmail, threats against civilians he'd sworn to protect. Nothing worked. Other officers cracked under pressure, made deals, found their breaking point. Cal Monroe just got quieter. "Sir," Lieutenant Hayes knocked softly on the doorframe. "We've received new orders." Cal looked up, and Hayes felt that familiar mix of respect and unease that came with looking into those green eyes. They weren't hard eyes exactly, but they were deep, like looking into a well that went down farther than you wanted to think about. "What's the mission, Hayes?" "Joint training exercise, sir, with hegemony forces, something called Project Convergence." Hayes handed over the datapad, trying not to show his distaste. Nobody in the Defense Corps liked working with aliens, especially not the hegemony. Too many good humans had died in their territory disputes. Cal scanned the orders, his expression unreadable. 6 months aboard, neutral station, cultural exchange, military cooperation, building bridges between species, political nonsense, in other words. "They specifically requested you, sir," Hayes added, "by name." That was unusual. Cal's reputation was built on battlefield excellence, not diplomacy. He was the guy you sent when things needed to be broken, not when they needed to be negotiated. "Any idea why?" Hayes shrugged. "Maybe they've heard about Kepler Station." Kepler Station, where Cal had held a defensive position for 16 hours against overwhelming odds, buying time for civilian evacuation ships, where he'd lost half his unit and still refused to abandon position, where he'd proven once again that some things were worth dying for. Cal stood moving with the controlled precision that marked all his actions. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. Economy of motion born from years of fighting in the vacuum of space, where every movement counted. Hayes, you know what the difference is between discipline and stubbornness. The lieutenant thought for a moment. No, sir. Discipline serves a purpose. Stubbornness serves pride. Cal pulled on his uniform jacket, the fabric rustling softly in the recycled air. And the problem with serving pride is that it makes you vulnerable to people who know how to stroke it. Hayes frowned, not quite understanding. Cal moved to the small mirror mounted beside his bunk and adjusted his collar. In the reflection, he could see Emma's photograph on his desk. 3 years dead, and he still heard her voice sometimes. Still felt responsible for the choices that had led to her death. Sir, are you saying you think this assignment is some kind of setup? Cal considered the question seriously the way he considered everything. In his experience, paranoia was often just pattern recognition, working faster than conscious thought. I'm saying that when someone specifically requests the one human officer with a reputation for being unbreakable, he turned away from the mirror. It usually means they want to see if they can break him. The ship's intercom crackled to life. All hands prepare for jump to Nexus Station. Departure in 30 minutes. Cal picked up his gear bag, the weight familiar and comforting in his hands. Inside were the tools of his trade. Weapons, medical supplies, tactical equipment. Everything a special forces officer needed to complete his mission and bring his people home. Everything except answers to the questions that were already forming in the back of his mind. Why him, why now? And why did he have the distinct feeling that this joint training exercise was going to be anything but routine? As the Defiance prepared to jump into hyperspace, Cal Monroe made his way to the bridge, carrying with him the weight of his reputation, the burden of his losses, and the unshakable conviction that some things, some people, some principles were worth protecting, no matter what it cost. He had no way of knowing that 3 sectors away, Commander Saryavel was already preparing the most sophisticated psychological trap in galactic history, a trap specifically designed for someone exactly like him, someone who cared too much to walk away. Nexus Station hung in the void like a metallic flower, its rotating sections catching starlight as ships from a dozen different species docked at its arms. Neutral territory, supposedly safe ground, where enemies could meet without killing each other. Commander Saryavel stood in the observation deck watching the UES Defiance maneuver toward Docking Bay 7. Through the reinforced viewport, she could see the angular lines of human engineering. Functional, efficient, no wasted curves or aesthetic flourishes. Just like their psychology, she mused. Everything served a purpose. Target acquired, she murmured into her personal calm, her breath fogging the cold glass. Her aide, Lieutenant Voss, materialized beside her with typical hegemony silence. Commander, the facility modifications are complete. Living quarters adjacent to the human captains. Shared training spaces, common areas designed to encourage interaction. Sarya nodded without taking her eyes off the approaching ship. 6 months to crack the unbreakable human. 6 months to prove that emotional attachment was just another weapon waiting to be turned against its wielder. And the surveillance, audio and visual monitoring in all common areas. Behavioral analysis algorithms running in real time. We'll know his heart rate when he sleeps, Commander. Perfect. Every glance, every gesture, every involuntary response would be cataloged and analyzed. She would map Calvin Monroe's psychological landscape with scientific precision. What about his background briefing? He knows this is a joint training exercise, cultural exchange, building bridges between our species. Voss's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. He has no idea he's a test subject. The docking clamps engaged with a soft thud that vibrated through the station's hull. Somewhere in that ship, Captain Monroe was preparing to walk into the most sophisticated psychological experiment in galactic history, and he thought he was here to build trust. Sarya turned away from the viewport, her mind already racing through the phases of her plan. Phase 1 would be the most delicate. Too aggressive, and he'd sense the manipulation. Too subtle, and nothing would happen. She needed to find that perfect balance between resistance and acceptance. Tell me about his psychological profile again. Voss consulted his datapad. Extreme loyalty to subordinates. Protective instincts bordering on the irrational. Strong moral code that appears to be internally generated rather than externally imposed. And he paused. An unusual capacity for emotional compartmentalization, following the death of his sister. Interesting. A man who could lock away grief and still function was either incredibly strong or incredibly damaged, probably both. Family connections, parents deceased, sister deceased, no romantic attachments on record. His emotional investments appear to be entirely professional. His unit, his mission, his principles. Even better, a man with no personal anchors was a man looking for something to believe in, something to protect, someone to trust, and Sarya was going to give him exactly that. The first phase would require her to be vulnerable. Not obviously so because Monroe would see through obvious manipulation, but carefully vulnerable. A crack in her armor just wide enough for a decent man to want to help. The second phase would be building shared experiences, combat training, strategic discussions, late-night conversations about the moral complexities of warfare. She would become his intellectual equal, his tactical partner, his friend. And in the third phase, when his defenses were down and his trust was complete, she would reveal the truth, that everything had been a lie, that his precious human emotions had made him a fool, that caring too much was exactly the weakness she'd always known it to be. The psychological damage would be complete. Monroe would return to Earth a broken man, his faith in connection shattered, and every human military officer would hear the story of how their best and brightest had been played like a child's toy by alien intelligence. It was going to be beautiful. Sarya made her way through the station's corridors toward the docking bay. She had chosen her appearance carefully for this first meeting, standard hegemony military uniform, but with the rank insignia slightly askew. Just enough to suggest someone under stress, someone who might need support. The airlock cycled and Captain Calvin Monroe stepped onto Nexus Station. He was exactly what she'd expected from his file photos. Tall, lean, with those distinctive human green eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His movements were economical, controlled, a predator in human form. But as their eyes met across the docking bay, Sarya felt an unexpected flutter of something that might have been nervousness, which was ridiculous. She was the architect. She had dissected the psychology of 100 different species. One human soldier, no matter how decorated, was just another puzzle to be solved. Captain Monroe, she said, stepping forward with her hand extended in the human gesture of greeting. I'm Commander Sarya Vel. I'll be your counterpart for this exercise. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, professional. And those green eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious about the carefully planned flaw in her appearance. Commander, he said simply, I look forward to working with you. Such a simple response, so typically human, no elaborate courtesies, no hidden meanings, just straightforward acknowledgement. It should have made her job easier. So why did she feel like she just stepped into a trap of her own, making, let me show you to your quarters, she said, gesturing toward the main corridor. We have a lot to discuss. As they walked side by side through the sterile corridors of Nexus Station, Commander Sarya Vel began the most important psychological campaign of her career. She had no way of knowing that she was about to discover something that would change everything she thought she knew about manipulation, trust, and the dangerous territory that lay between them. The hunt had begun. The question was, who exactly was the hunter? 3 weeks into the exercise, Sarya was beginning to understand why Calvin Monroe had never been broken. It wasn't because he was impervious to manipulation. It was because he was so fundamentally decent that trying to manipulate him felt like trying to poison a well. She'd started with the standard approaches, shared vulnerability during their morning tactical briefings, a carefully timed stumble during combat training that would give him the opportunity to play hero. Small moments of apparent weakness designed to trigger his protective instincts. Cal had helped her up from that stumble with the same steady professionalism he showed everyone. No lingering touch, no meaningful eye contact, no sign that he saw her as anything other than a colleague who'd lost her footing. You might want to adjust your stance, he'd said simply. The artificial gravity in this section runs about 8% higher than standard. Throws off your center of balance until you compensate for it. He'd noticed the gravity differential. Of course he had. While she was busy orchestrating emotional manipulation, he was cataloging environmental factors that might affect performance. It was infuriating. and somehow inexplicably impressive. During their strategic planning sessions, she'd tried a different approach: intellectual seduction, sharing tactical insights that revealed the depth of her strategic thinking, waiting for that moment of recognition when he would see her as an equal worth trusting. Instead, Cal had listened carefully to every word, asked thoughtful questions, and then improved on her strategies with suggestions so practical and elegant that she found herself genuinely learning from him. The problem with most tactical doctrine, he'd said during one late-night session, is that it assumes your enemy will behave logically. But in my experience, the most dangerous moments come when someone acts against their own best interests. He'd been looking directly at her when he said it, those green eyes steady and unreadable. For a moment, she'd wondered if he somehow knew. But then he'd continued explaining his point about psychological warfare, and she'd realized he was simply being thorough. The man was a professional to his core. Every interaction was filtered through the lens of duty, mission, and tactical effectiveness. She couldn't find a personal angle because he didn't seem to have personal angles. It should have made him easy to predict, should have made him vulnerable to the right emotional pressure. Instead, it made him completely unpredictable in the most frustrating way possible. Take yesterday's incident in the recreation facility. Saria had arranged to be there during his workout time, had positioned herself to appear isolated and contemplative, the perfect setup for a concerned colleague to inquire about her well-being. Cal had entered, nodded politely, and proceeded with his exercise routine. But after 20 minutes, he'd approached her with a cup of coffee from the dispenser. "You look like you could use this," he'd said, not a question about her mood, not an invitation to share her troubles, just a simple observation and a simple kindness. She'd taken the coffee, searched his face for any sign of ulterior motive, and found nothing but genuine concern for a colleague who seemed tired. "Thank you," she'd managed. "No problem. Sometimes the hardest part of being away from home is remembering to take care of yourself." Away from home. He'd assumed her contemplative mood was homesickness, a reasonable assumption and a kind one. It hadn't occurred to him that her behavior might be calculated, because that's not how his mind worked. Later that week, during a joint training exercise involving hostage rescue scenarios, Saria had discovered something that made her blood run cold. Cal Monroe was absolutely brilliant at reading people, not in the way of a manipulator looking for weaknesses, but in the way of a protector looking for threats. He'd noticed tells and patterns in the training actors that she'd missed entirely, had accurately predicted behavioral responses 3 moves ahead, had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of psychological pressure that rivaled her own analytical approach. The man who seemed immune to manipulation was actually a master of human psychology. He just chose not to use that knowledge as a weapon. The thing about reading people, he'd explained to her after the exercise, is that once you can see how someone thinks you have a choice, you can use that insight to hurt them or you can use it to help them. And the choice you make, well, that says more about you than it does about them. She'd stared at him, trying to process the implications of what he just said. "Don't you ever get tempted," she'd asked, "to use what you know to get what you want?" Cal had considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. Every day. But wanting something doesn't mean you should take it. And being able to hurt someone doesn't mean you should hurt them. He'd paused, looking out through the training facility's viewport at the stars beyond. "My sister used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they're capable of doing. It's what they choose not to do when no one's watching." His sister, the one who died in the medical relief mission. Saria had that information in his file, but hearing him mention her so casually, so naturally, made it real in a way that data points never could. "She sounds like she was wise," Saria had said, and for once she hadn't been calculating the emotional impact of her words. She was, and stubborn, and completely convinced that people were basically good, even when evidence suggested otherwise. There had been something in his voice then, not grief exactly, but loss, the kind of loss that changes how you see the world. "Do you think she was right?" Saria had asked. Cal had looked at her then with those steady green eyes, and she'd felt suddenly exposed, as if he could see all the way through her carefully constructed persona to the person underneath. "I think she was right about the important things. I think most people want to do the right thing, even when it costs them. even when it's hard. The conversation had ended there, but Sarya had found herself thinking about it for days afterward, because Calvin Monroe wasn't resistant to her manipulation in the way she'd expected. He wasn't cold or suspicious or emotionally unavailable. He was just genuinely, authentically good, and somehow that made everything she was trying to do feel small and ugly and wrong, which was ridiculous. She was conducting legitimate psychological research, proving important points about human vulnerability. This was science, not cruelty. But as the weeks passed and her carefully planned emotional traps continued to fail, Sarya began to suspect that the real problem wasn't with her methodology. The real problem was that Calvin Monroe was exactly who he appeared to be, and that terrified her more than any enemy she'd ever faced. It happened during a routine tactical simulation on day 37. The scenario was simple: civilian evacuation under hostile fire, multiple casualty situations, limited resources, the kind of impossible choice that military commanders faced when the universe decided to test their principles against their pragmatism. Sarya had designed the simulation herself, carefully crafting variables that would force Cal to choose between tactical efficiency and emotional attachment. She wanted to see him crack under the weight of impossible decisions. Instead, she watched him save everyone, not through brilliant strategy or superior firepower, but through something she'd never seen before. He'd looked at the simulation parameters, ignored the tactical manual entirely, and started making decisions based on what the people involved would actually do rather than what they should do. "The wounded civilian in Sector 7, he'd said, pointing to the holographic display. "Former military. See the way he's positioning himself to shield the others. He's not going to evacuate unless everyone else goes first." Sarya had checked the simulation files. The civilian's military background was buried deep in the character notes, something she'd added for realism but never expected anyone to notice. "The medical officer," Cal continued, "is going to try to stay with the most critically wounded, even if it means missing the evacuation window. That's not tactical thinking, that's who she is." He'd been right about that too, and about the family group that would refuse to separate, and about the engineer who would volunteer to stay behind to maintain the evacuation systems. "How did you know all that?" Sarya had asked as the simulation ended with a perfect evacuation. "Zero casualties. Complete mission success." Cal had looked at her with those steady green eyes, and for a moment she'd seen something that might have been surprise. "You read the character profiles, right? I mean, really read them." She had. Multiple times. Every tactical detail, every capability assessment, every strategic variable. "But you didn't read the people," he'd continued. "You read their functions, their roles. But every person in that simulation had a story, had reasons for being who they are, had choices they would make based on those stories." That's when it hit her. Cal Monroe didn't see tactical problems. He saw people with problems that needed solving. "The art of war isn't about moving pieces on a board," he'd said almost to himself. "It's about understanding that every piece is someone's brother, someone's daughter, someone's hope for the future." The words had hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Sarya was only beginning to understand. Later that evening, they'd found themselves in the station's observation lounge. It wasn't planned, at least not by Sarya. She'd been there first, staring out at the stars and trying to process what she'd witnessed during the simulation. Cal had entered, quietly ordered coffee from the dispenser, and settled into a chair across from her without invitation or permission, just joining her in the quiet. "You're thinking pretty hard about something," he'd observed. It wasn't manipulation, wasn't an attempt to draw information from her, just genuine observation from someone who'd learned to read the signs of a troubled mind. And that's when Sarya had made a decision that would change everything. She'd decided to tell him the truth, not the whole truth. Not about the experiment or the surveillance or the trap she'd built around him, but truth about herself, real truth for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I've been thinking about something you said, about reading people versus reading functions." She'd paused, surprised by how difficult it was to form the words. "I think I've spent so long thinking tactically that I've forgotten how to think personally." Cal had nodded, unsurprised. "It's an occupational hazard. Military training teaches you to see everything as a problem to be solved. Sometimes you forget that most problems have people at the center of them." "How do you remember?" The question had slipped out before she could stop it. Genuine curiosity from someone who genuinely didn't know the answer. Cal had been quiet for a long moment, looking out at the stars. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that she'd never heard before. I had a sister, Emma. She was a medical officer, part of the relief corps that went into war zones to help civilians. He'd paused, his fingers unconsciously moving to his chest, where Sarya knew he kept that worn photograph. She used to say that the moment you stop seeing people as people, you've already lost the war that matters. Sarya had waited, sensing that there was more. 3 years ago, there was a situation on Kepler Station. Civilian population caught between two military forces. Command wanted to evacuate the strategic personnel and abandon the rest. Too risky, they said. Too costly. His voice had grown quieter, but not weak. Just careful, like someone handling something fragile. Emma volunteered to stay with the medical team. Said someone had to be there for the people who couldn't evacuate themselves. Said it was what doctors do. Sarya had felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew how this story ended. It was in his file. But hearing it from him, seeing the way his hands remained steady, even as his voice carried the weight of loss, was different. The evacuation went wrong. Political miscommunication. The relief ships were delayed. Emma's team was trapped in the medical center when the station came under fire. He'd stopped talking then, but Sarya could see the rest of the story in his eyes. The impossible choice between tactical withdrawal and certain death. The decision that had cost lives and changed everything. I was the tactical commander for the evacuation, he'd said finally. I followed orders, pulled back the military personnel, left the civilians, left her. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Command said it was the right call, saved more lives than we lost. Tactically sound, strategically necessary. Sarya had found herself leaning forward, drawn into the gravity of his pain. But Emma died because I chose tactics over people. Because I followed doctrine instead of conscience. Because when it mattered most, I thought like a soldier instead of like a brother. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of regret and loss, and the kind of guilt that changes a person at the cellular level. Is that why you don't trust tactics anymore? Sarya had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cal had looked at her then, and she'd seen something in his eyes that was deeper than grief. Something like wisdom earned through suffering. I don't distrust tactics. I distrust systems that forget people are more than variables in an equation. I distrust any approach that treats human life as acceptable collateral damage. He'd paused. I distrust anyone who thinks they're smart enough to decide who lives and who dies based on spreadsheets and strategic projections, including her. The words weren't spoken, but Sarya heard them anyway. So now I try to remember what Emma knew, that every person has value, that every choice has consequences, that being right tactically doesn't mean much if you're wrong morally. Sarya had sat in the growing darkness of the observation lounge, watching Cal's reflection in the viewport blend with the stars beyond, and realized that everything she thought she knew about strength and weakness had just been turned upside down. Because Calvin Monroe hadn't been broken by his sister's death. He'd been forged by it, shaped into something harder and softer at the same time. Someone who could make the impossible decisions when necessary, but who would never again forget the human cost of those decisions. Thank you, she'd said finally, for telling me that. Cal had looked at her with something that might have been surprise. Thank you for listening. Most people hear that story and either want to reassure me that I made the right call, or they want to argue about military necessity. You just listened. And that's when Sarya had realized that something fundamental had shifted in the space between them. She was no longer playing a role, no longer executing a strategy. She was just talking to another person about the weight of difficult choices and the burden of living with consequences. For the first time in years, Commander Sarya Vel was having a real conversation, and it terrified her more than any enemy fire she'd ever faced. The reports were becoming a problem. Every week, Sarya submitted her psychological assessment of Captain Monroe to Hegemony Command. Every week, she found herself struggling to write what they wanted to hear. Week 1 had been easy. Subject shows typical human emotional vulnerability, responds to simulated distress scenarios, psychological attachment forming as predicted. Week 4 had been harder. Subject demonstrates unexpected tactical awareness. Manipulation attempts require more subtle approach. Emotional investment remains on schedule. Week 8 had been creative. Subject psychological profile more complex than initial assessment. Recommend extended observation period for comprehensive analysis. But sitting in her quarters at week 12, staring at a blank report screen, Saria couldn't find the words to describe what was actually happening. Because what was happening was that Calvin Monroe was destroying her from the inside out, and he wasn't even trying. Every tool she'd used to manipulate him had somehow turned into a mirror, reflecting her own motivations back at her with uncomfortable clarity. The vulnerability she'd performed had become real vulnerability. The intellectual discussions she'd orchestrated to build false intimacy had become genuine exchanges of ideas that challenged everything she thought she knew about herself. And the worst part was that Cal seemed completely unaware of the effect he was having. He treated her exactly the same way he treated everyone else. With respect, with professional courtesy, with that quiet kindness that seemed to be as natural to him as breathing. He wasn't seducing her or manipulating her or trying to turn her against her own mission. He was just being himself. And somehow that was more destructive than any psychological warfare she'd ever encountered. The breaking point had come 3 days ago during a joint tactical exercise, a hostage scenario involving a diplomatic crisis between species, the kind of situation that required political finesse as much as military precision. Saria had suggested the standard hegemony approach neutralize the threat extract. The hostages deal with the diplomatic fallout later. Clean, efficient, effective. Minimal casualties, maximum strategic gain. Cal had listened to her proposal with that careful attention. He gave everything, nodding at appropriate intervals, asking clarifying questions about timing and logistics. Then he'd quietly suggested an alternative. What if we tried talking to them first? Such a simple question, such a human response, and such a complete rejection of everything she'd been trained to believe about conflict resolution. Talking to terrorists only validates their position, she'd said, reciting doctrine that had been drilled into her since academy training. Maybe, or maybe they're not terrorists. Maybe they're just people who feel like they don't have any other options. Cal had pulled up the intelligence reports on their screens, highlighting details that Saria had cataloged, but not really considered. Look at their demands. They're not asking for money or weapons or strategic advantage. They're asking for medical supplies for a refugee settlement, food for children, basic humanitarian aid. Saria had looked at the data with new eyes, seeing patterns she'd missed in her focus on tactical variables. They've been petitioning the Galactic Council for 8 months, Cal continued, filed proper requests through official channels, followed every bureaucratic protocol, and they've been ignored. He'd paused, looking at her with those steady green eyes that seemed to see everything. Sometimes people do desperate things, not because they're evil, but because they're desperate. And then he'd done something that had shattered her remaining emotional defenses. He'd asked her opinion, not her tactical assessment, not her strategic recommendation. Her opinion, what she thought they should do, as if her thoughts mattered, as if she was a person whose judgment he valued rather than a target whose weaknesses he was trying to exploit. I think, she'd started, then stopped, realizing she didn't know what she thought. For the first time in her adult life, she was being asked to consider a situation from a perspective other than pure tactical advantage. I think I don't know how to think about problems that way, she'd admitted finally. Cal had smiled then, not a triumphant smile or a condescending smile, but something warm and understanding. It took me a long time to learn too. My sister used to say that the hardest part of being human isn't figuring out what you can do. It's figuring out what you should do. Emma, again, the sister whose death had taught him to value people over tactics, the ghost that haunted his decisions and shaped his choices, and made him into someone who could see past strategic objectives to human consequences. How do you live with the uncertainty? Saria had asked. How do you make decisions when you can't calculate all the variables? You do your best with the information you have, and you try to choose the option that lets you sleep at night. Such a simple answer, and such a foreign concept to someone who'd been trained to optimize outcomes rather than wrestle with conscience. They'd ended up implementing Cal's approach to the hostage scenario, opening communication channels, listening to demands, treating the hostage takers as people with legitimate grievances rather than tactical problems to be eliminated. It had worked. Not perfectly, not without complications, but it had worked. The hostages had been released. The humanitarian aid had been delivered. The underlying political tensions had been addressed through negotiation rather than force. And Saria had found herself wondering what other conflicts might be resolved if people approached them with Cal's combination of tactical competence and genuine empathy, which was a dangerous line of thinking for someone whose entire career was built on the superiority of calculated strategic dominance. But the most dangerous moment had come afterward, when Cal had found her in the debriefing room staring at the successful mission reports and trying to process what had just happened. "You did good work today," he'd said simply. Not congratulations on successful manipulation, not praise for tactical execution, just recognition of her contribution to something that had made the galaxy a little bit better. "I don't understand," she'd said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Understand what, why you trust me?" The question had been burning in her chest for weeks. "You don't know anything about me, my background, my motivations, my agenda. For all you know, I could be gathering intelligence on human tactical methods. I could be planning to use everything I learn here against your people." Cal had considered this seriously the way he considered everything. "You could be," he'd agreed finally, "but I don't think you are. How can you be so sure?" He'd looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Because if you were here to hurt people, you wouldn't have spent the last hour trying to figure out how to help them." Such a simple observation, such obvious logic, and such a complete demolition of every cynical assumption about motivation and loyalty that had shaped her worldview. "Besides," he'd added, "trust isn't about being sure. It's about choosing to believe in someone's better nature even when you can't prove it exists." That night alone in her quarters, Saria had sat in the darkness and tried to remember the last time someone had chosen to believe in her better nature. She couldn't. In her world, trust was earned through demonstrated competence and proven loyalty. Relationships were built on mutual advantage and strategic alignment. People collaborated because it served their interests, not because they genuinely cared about each other's welfare. But Cal Monroe operated from a completely different paradigm. He trusted first and verified later. He assumed good intentions until proven otherwise. He treated everyone as if they were capable of being better than they actually were. And somehow, impossibly, that approach seemed to make people actually want to be better, including her, which was the most terrifying realization of all. Because Saria was beginning to understand that the trap she'd built for Calvin Monroe hadn't just failed to capture him, it had captured her instead. And she had no idea how to escape from something she'd built herself. The message from Hegemony Command arrived at 347 station time, when the corridors were empty, and the only sounds were the distant hum of life support systems and the occasional footstep of a night shift technician. Saria read it 3 times before the words fully registered. "Project Convergence Psychological Assessment Overdue. Submit comprehensive analysis of human subject psychological vulnerabilities within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate reassignment and project termination." Project termination, which meant Calvin Monroe would be transferred to a different facility, a different commander, someone who would approach his psychological profile with the clinical detachment that Saria had somehow lost, someone who would see him as a test subject rather than a person. The thought made her physically ill. She stared at the message for another 20 minutes, watching the cursor blink in the reply field, before finally typing a response that would buy her time she didn't know how to use. "Assessment requires additional observational data. Request 72-hour extension for comprehensive analysis." It was a lie. She had more than enough data. Months of behavioral observations, recorded conversations, detailed psychological profiles. Everything Command wanted to prove that humans could be manipulated through emotional attachment. Everything except the proof that the manipulation had actually worked. Because the terrible truth was that Calvin Monroe remained exactly who he'd always been. Decent, principled, impossible to corrupt. If anything, their months of interaction had only reinforced his core beliefs about trust, loyalty, and the fundamental worth of treating others with respect. The manipulation had failed completely, But somehow Saria couldn't bring herself to write that in a report. The next morning, she found Cal in the hydroponics bay, tending to a small garden that had become his unofficial responsibility over the past few weeks. He was kneeling among the tomato plants, carefully checking for signs of disease or nutrient deficiency, his movements gentle and precise. "Didn't know you were a farmer," she said, trying to keep her voice light. Cal looked up with that familiar half-smile that had become so dangerous to her emotional equilibrium. "Emma taught me, said that growing things was good for the soul, reminded you that life wants to happen even in the most artificial environments." Emma again, always Emma, the sister whose memory shaped every decision he made and every kindness he showed. "Cal, we need to talk." Something in her tone must have warned him because his expression grew more serious. He stood brushing soil from his hands and gave her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" This was it, the moment she'd been dreading for weeks. The choice between continuing the deception and destroying the only genuine relationship she'd had in years. This whole exercise, this cultural exchange program, it's not what you think it is. Cal waited patient as always, giving her space to find the words. "I mean, it is a cultural exchange, but it's also more than that." She took a breath, struggling with words that felt like swallowing glass. "You're here because of me, because I requested you specifically, because I convinced my superiors that you would be an ideal test subject for a psychological study." The silence that followed was deafening. Cal's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A careful withdrawal that made Saria's chest tighten with panic. "What kind of study?" he asked quietly. "Emotional manipulation, psychological vulnerability assessment. My commanders wanted to prove that human emotional attachments could be weaponized, that your tendency to form personal bonds made you exploitable." Each word felt like a confession that was tearing pieces out of her soul. They wanted to prove that caring too much was a weakness that could be turned against you. Cal absorbed this information with the same careful attention he gave everything else. No dramatic reaction, no explosion of anger or betrayal. Just that steady, analytical gaze that had always seen more than she was comfortable with. "And what did you discover?" he asked finally. The question was so typical of him. No accusations, no demands for justification. Just genuine curiosity about the results of an experiment he'd unknowingly participated in. "That I was wrong about everything." Saria's voice broke on the words, surprising them both. "I was wrong about manipulation. I was wrong about emotional attachments. I was wrong about weakness and strength and what it means to trust someone." She met his eyes, forcing herself to hold that steady gaze. "And I was wrong about you." Cal considered this for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously moving to his chest, where he kept Emma's photograph. "What did you think you'd find? Someone I could break. Someone whose caring nature would make him vulnerable to the right psychological pressure. Someone who would prove that human emotional bonds were just another weapon waiting to be exploited." And instead, Saria felt tears threatening an emotional response that would have horrified her 6 months ago. "Instead, I found someone who made me question everything I thought I knew about strength. Someone who showed me that caring about people isn't a weakness to be exploited, it's a strength that makes everything else worthwhile." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw, and more vulnerable than any strategic deception she'd ever attempted. Cal was quiet for so long that Saria began to wonder if he was going to respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that she'd never heard before. "You built this to expose a flaw in me, but all it did was reveal something broken in you." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. "You've spent months trying to prove that emotional attachment is a weakness, but the only person who got hurt was you. Because you're the one who's been living without genuine connection. You're the one who's been afraid to trust anyone with who you really are." Saria felt something crumble inside her chest. Some defensive wall that had been holding back years of carefully suppressed longing for exactly the kind of authentic relationship that Cal offered everyone around him. "I don't know how to be that person," she whispered. "I don't know how to trust without calculating angles. I don't know how to care about someone without wondering what it cost me." Cal stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring, in a way that made her want to lean into his strength, then learn. Such a simple suggestion, such an impossible task. What if I can't? What if this is who I am? What if I'm too damaged to be the kind of person who deserves the trust you've been giving me? Cal looked at her with those green eyes that had seen through every deception she'd attempted and somehow still managed to find something worth believing in. Then you'll keep trying until you figure it out. Because that's what people do when they care about each other. They don't give up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of experience and loss and hard-won wisdom. Emma used to say that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's whether they're willing to learn from them, whether they're willing to be better tomorrow than they were today. Sarya felt the last of her emotional defenses collapse under the gentle pressure of his unwavering faith in human potential. I have to submit a report to my commanders, she said. They want proof that the experiment worked, that I successfully manipulated you into emotional vulnerability. And what are you going to tell them? Sarya looked around the hydroponics bay at the carefully tended plants that Cal had nurtured, simply because it was the right thing to do. At the evidence of his quiet kindness and unconscious generosity, at the man who had somehow managed to save her from herself without even trying. I'm going to tell them the truth, that the experiment was a complete failure, that you can't manipulate someone who genuinely cares about other people. That emotional attachment isn't a weakness to be exploited, it's a strength that makes people unbreakable. She met his eyes, feeling something like courage building in her chest. And then I'm going to resign my commission and hope that there's still time to learn how to be the kind of person you've been treating me like I already am. Cal smiled, then the first genuinely happy expression she'd ever seen on his face. There's always time for that, he said. Trust me, I know something about second chances. In the growing light of the hydroponics bay, surrounded by plants that grew strong in artificial soil under synthetic suns, Saryavel began to understand that some things couldn't be calculated or controlled or manipulated. Some things could only be chosen. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to choose hope over fear, even if she had no idea what came next. The alarm began as a low pulse that vibrated through the station's hull building to a shriek that made conversation impossible. Emergency lights bathed the hydroponics bay in harsh red, turning Cal's face into a mask of sharp angles and deep shadows. His transformation was instantaneous. One moment he was a man offering comfort to someone struggling with conscience, the next he was a military officer calculating threats and response times. Hull breach in Section 7, he said, reading the scrolling emergency data on his wrist display. Atmospheric pressure dropping fast. That's where the civilian research teams are working. Sarya felt her own training kick in tactical analysis overriding emotional turmoil. Hegemony rapid response protocols call for immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. Seal affected sections, minimize casualties, preserve station integrity. Cal was already moving toward the exit, his movements precise and purposeful. How long until your people arrive? 12 minutes for full tactical response, maybe 8 for first wave. He stopped, turning back to look at her with those green eyes that had seen too much combat and too much loss. The research teams won't last 12 minutes, not if the hull breach is expanding. Sarya felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew what he was thinking, knew what he was about to suggest, and knew that everything she'd ever learned about tactical decision-making said it was insane. Cal, you can't be serious. You're not equipped for emergency hull repair. You don't have backup. You don't even have proper atmospheric gear. I have basic emergency equipment, and I have training. And I have the station's schematics, Sarya found herself saying. Emergency repair protocols, structural integrity assessments. They looked at each other across the red-lit space, and Sarya realized that the choice had already been made, not through tactical analysis or strategic planning, but through the simple recognition that people were dying and they had the skills to help. This is insane, she said, even as she began accessing station emergency systems through her command interface. Probably, Cal agreed, checking his emergency kit, but that's never stopped anyone from doing the right thing. The right thing, such a simple concept, such a foreign way of making decisions for someone who'd been trained to think in terms of acceptable losses and strategic priorities. They moved through the station corridors together, past emergency teams heading in the opposite direction, past the evacuation routes that would have taken them to safety, toward the danger zone where atmospheric pressure was dropping by the second and structural failure was becoming more likely with each passing minute. Section 7 emergency bulkhead is sealed. Saria reported reading data from her portable interface. But the seal isn't holding. Microfractures in the hull are spreading. We have maybe 20 minutes before catastrophic decompression. How many people? 14 researchers, mixed species, no combat training. Cal processed this information with the same calm attention he gave everything else, as if running toward a hull breach in an uncontrolled emergency was just another tactical exercise. Can you override the emergency lockdown remotely? Saria's fingers flew over her interface, calling up security protocols she'd helped design months ago. Back when her biggest concern was psychological manipulation, rather than preventing people from dying in vacuum. Override confirmed. But Cal, once we're in there, if the hull fails completely, we'll deal with that when it happens. Such confidence, such absolute faith that doing the right thing would somehow lead to the right outcome, even when every calculation suggested otherwise. They reached the emergency bulkhead where the temperature had already dropped 10 degrees, and the air carried the metallic taste of fear and failing life support. Through the reinforced viewport, they could see the research team huddled in the center of the lab, surrounded by equipment that was useless against the growing vacuum beyond the hull. Emergency atmosphere suits are in the storage locker, Cal said, pulling on protective gear with practiced efficiency. We go and assess the situation and get everyone to the emergency pods. And if the pods are damaged, then we improvise. Improvise. Such a human solution to an impossible problem. Such an alien concept to someone trained to plan for every contingency. The bulkhead cycled open and they stepped into chaos. The hull breach was worse than the sensors had indicated. Not a clean rupture that could be sealed with emergency foam, but a spreading network of fractures that ran across 3 structural support beams. The kind of damage that required shipyard facilities and engineering crews, not 2 people with emergency repair kits. It's too extensive, Saria said, her voice muffled by the emergency atmosphere mask. We can't repair this. We need to evacuate immediately. But Cal was already moving toward the research team, his presence somehow calming their panic through sheer force of competent authority. We're getting you out of here, he told them, his voice carrying clearly through the emergency communication system. Emergency pods are functional. We'll get you to the evacuation ships. Dr. Yeneth, the lead researcher, grabbed Cal's arm with all 4 of her manipulator appendages. The hull is failing. The emergency pods won't launch if structural integrity drops below safety parameters. Saria felt her tactical training take over, calculating probabilities and weighing options with the cold precision that had made her such an effective commander. Primary evacuation route is blocked by atmospheric pressure differentials. Secondary route requires manual override of 3 separate safety systems. Probability of successful evacuation drops to 37% if we wait for standard rescue protocols. The numbers were clear. The logical choice was obvious. Cut losses, seal the section, save who you could save. But then she looked at Cal, who was helping an injured researcher toward the emergency pods with the same careful attention he'd shown her tomato plants. Who was treating every person in that lab as if their life had infinite value rather than statistical significance. And suddenly the numbers didn't matter anymore. Unless, she heard herself saying, we manually stabilize the hull fractures while the evacuation proceeds. Cal looked at her with something that might have been surprise. That would require someone to stay behind, to monitor the repairs while everyone else evacuates. If the hull fails, you're seen, then whoever stays behind dies, Saria finished. I know. She pulled up the emergency repair protocols on her interface, showing Cal the schematic of temporary support beams and emergency sealant systems. It would work. Probably. Long enough to get everyone to the pods and clear of the danger zone. Cal studied the plans with that careful attention that meant he was seeing all the implications she wasn't saying out loud. It's a one-person job, he said finally. Yes. And there's no guarantee the person doing it survives. No. They looked at each other through the visors of their emergency gear, and Sarya saw the moment when Cal made his decision. The same decision he'd probably made a dozen times before in situations where someone had to take the risk so others could live. "I'll do it," he said simply. And that's when Sarya's world collapsed. Not because of hull failure or atmospheric decompression or any of the physical dangers surrounding them, but because she suddenly understood what it meant to care about someone more than you cared about tactical advantage. "No," she said, the word torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "No, you're not sacrificing yourself for a bunch of strangers. Not when I'm the one who got you into this situation. Not when I'm the one who's been lying to you for months." Cal looked at her with those steady green eyes, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression. "Sarya, I'm the one who knows these systems. I'm the one who helped design the emergency protocols. I'm the one who can make this work." She was already moving toward the emergency repair station, her hands steady, despite the fear that was threatening to overwhelm her. "Besides," she added, trying to inject some lightness into her voice, "you have people to get home to. I'm just a hegemony officer who's probably going to be court-martialed anyway." Cal caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. "That's not true." "Wes, which part?" "Any of it. You have people who need you too. Maybe not in the same way, but they need you. And you're not just a hegemony officer. You're someone who figured out that caring about people is worth more than being right." Sarya felt tears gathering behind her emergency visor and realized that she was crying not from fear, but from something that felt almost like gratitude. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be the person who makes choices based on what's right instead of what's smart." Cal's hand tightened on her arm, anchoring her to something solid in a world that was literally falling apart around them. "Then we'll figure it out together, both of us, after we get everyone out of here." The hull breach chose that moment to expand with a sound like thunder, and suddenly there was no more time for conversation or philosophy or the luxury of debating who should take the risk. There was only the work of saving lives one person at a time in a universe that didn't care about tactical superiority or strategic advantage, only about the choices people made when everything else fell away. The emergency had lasted 4 hours and 37 minutes, long enough to evacuate 14 researchers, repair 3 critical hull breaches, and reroute power through backup systems that hadn't been tested since the station's construction. Long enough for Sarya to discover that she could make life or death decisions based on instinct rather than calculation. Long enough for Cal to prove once again that humans approached impossible situations by simply refusing to accept that they were impossible. And long enough for both of them to survive what should have killed them, working together with a coordination that felt like they'd been partners for years instead of months. But now the emergency was over. The researchers were safe, the hull was stable, the station was returning to normal operations with the quiet efficiency that marked any good crisis response, and Cal was leaving. Sarya stood in the docking bay, watching the UES Defiance undergo final departure preparations. Watching technicians complete their pre-flight checks and cargo handlers finish loading supplies. Watching the normal bureaucratic choreography that preceded every routine departure. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing dramatic or emotional or worthy of the significance it carried in her chest. Captain Calvin Monroe's assignment to Nexus Station was complete. Project Convergence was officially terminated. He was returning to active duty with his own people carrying classified tactical assessments and cultural exchange reports that would help shape future human-alien cooperation. Standard procedure, exactly as planned. Except that somewhere in the past 6 months, the plan had stopped mattering. "Commander Vell," Lieutenant Voss appeared at her elbow with typical hegemony punctuality. "The final project reports are ready for your review. Command is requesting immediate transmission of all psychological assessment data." Sarya took the data pad without looking away from the ship. "Any specific requests from Command?" "They want confirmation that the experiment produced actionable intelligence on human psychological vulnerabilities. Evidence that emotional manipulation protocols are effective against human military personnel." Of course they did. That had always been the point. Prove that humans could be controlled through their emotional attachments. Demonstrate that caring too much was a weakness that could be exploited by more rational species. "And what am I supposed to tell them?" Voss looked confused by the question. "The truth, Commander. that the subject was successfully manipulated through carefully orchestrated emotional connection. That human trust can be weaponized against them. Saria finally looked at her aide, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. Young, ambitious, completely convinced that psychological manipulation was just another tool in the arsenal of interspecies politics, the way she'd been 6 months ago. What if that's not what happened, Lieutenant? I don't understand. What if the subject wasn't manipulated at all? What if he saw through every attempt at emotional control and simply chose to treat his supposed manipulator with respect anyway? Voss frowned, accessing his own data files. Commander, the surveillance data clearly shows increasing emotional investment on both sides. Deepening trust, personal disclosure, behavioral modification, consistent with attachment formation. On both sides, Saria repeated, not just his side, both sides. The implications of what she was saying began to dawn on Voss's expression. Commander, are you suggesting that you were emotionally compromised during the experiment? Such clinical language. Such a sanitized way to describe the complete reconstruction of everything she thought she knew about herself. I'm suggesting that the experiment revealed something we weren't expecting, that maybe the humans aren't the ones with the vulnerability problem. Before Voss could respond, the docking bay announcement system crackled to life. UES Defiance, you are cleared for departure. Safe travels. Through the observation window, Saria watched the ship's engines ignite with blue fire. Watched the elegant dance of gravitational release as the vessel pulled away from the station's docking clamps. Watched Calvin Monroe disappear from her life as quietly and professionally as he'd entered it. No dramatic farewell, no promises to stay in touch, no acknowledgement that anything significant had passed between them. Just a polite handshake in the corridor outside his quarters, a brief, "Thank you for everything," and the kind of respectful nod that career military personnel exchange when duty calls them in different directions. As if 6 months of psychological warfare disguised as cooperation had been nothing more than routine professional interaction. As if he hadn't completely demolished her worldview and rebuilt it into something unrecognizable. As if she hadn't fallen in love with someone who probably saw her as just another colleague in an endless succession of temporary assignments. The worst part was that his casual professionalism was probably genuine. Cal Monroe was exactly the kind of person who could form meaningful connections with people and then let them go without drama when circumstances changed. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to respect other people's choices and obligations, even when those obligations took them away from him. Commander Voss was still waiting for direction about the reports. File the assessment as inconclusive. Tell command that human psychological manipulation requires further study with different methodological approaches. But Commander, the surveillance data shows that I was compromised, Lieutenant. That makes any conclusions about the subject's vulnerability unreliable. She handed back the data pad without reviewing its contents. Professional recommendation is to abandon this particular research avenue and focus on conventional tactical analysis. Voss looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression discouraged further discussion. Yes, Commander. Will there be anything else? No, dismissed. After Voss left, Saria remained in the observation lounge watching the stars wheel slowly past as the station continued its eternal rotation. Thinking about psychological experiments and emotional attachments and the difference between manipulation and genuine connection. Thinking about a man who treated her with consistent kindness even when he had every reason to be suspicious of her motives. Thinking about what it meant to realize you'd been living your entire life wrong and having that realization come too late to matter. She was still there 3 hours later when her personal communicator chimed with an incoming message. Local transmission from somewhere on the station. The message was short, just 2 lines of text, but seeing Cal's communication signature attached to it made her heart race in a way that no amount of tactical training had prepared her for. Thought you might want to check the hydroponics bay. Something there that belongs to you. Saria stared at the message for a full minute before making her way through the station corridors to the small garden where they'd had so many conversations about tactics and trust and the weight of difficult choices. The bay looked exactly the same as always. Rows of carefully tended plants growing under artificial sunlight. the quiet hum of circulation systems and automated watering schedules. But there, tucked between the tomato plants Cal had been nurturing, was a small data chip attached to a handwritten note. Saria picked up the note with hands that weren't quite steady, recognizing Cal's precise handwriting. Saria, you didn't fail the mission. You just realized what really matters can't be gamed. The data chip contains everything you need for your real report. The one that tells the truth about what happened here, about what you learned and what I learned, and why that matters more than any tactical advantage. Emma would have liked you. She always said the best people are the ones who figure out how to be better than they thought they could be. You're going to be fine. Trust me on this one, Cal. Saria sank into the chair beside the garden, holding the note like a lifeline. He'd known. Of course he'd known. Probably from the very beginning, he'd understood exactly what Project Convergence was designed to accomplish. Had seen through her careful manipulation attempts and chosen to play along, not because he was vulnerable to emotional control, but because he recognized someone struggling to understand what it meant to connect with another person. He'd let her practice being genuine until it stopped being practice and started being real. And then he'd quietly disappeared from her life, leaving behind exactly what she needed to move forward. Not dramatic declarations or promises of future contact, but simple recognition that she'd learned something important about herself, that she was capable of being better than she'd thought possible. Saria inserted the data chip into her personal interface and began to read Cal's assessment of their 6 months together. Not the sanitized version she'd been struggling to write for command, but an honest evaluation of what had actually happened between them. An evaluation that began with a single line that made her laugh and cry at the same time. Commander Saria Vel is the most dangerous person I've ever met. Not because she's skilled at manipulation, but because she's capable of genuine change. And in my experience, people who can change themselves are the ones who end up changing the world. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of connection and growth that played out in the spaces between them. But inside the hydroponic space, surrounded by plants that grew strong in artificial soil under synthetic suns, Saria Vel began to understand that some seeds take time to germinate, and that the most important harvests are the ones you never see coming. 6 weeks after the UES Defiance disappeared into hyperspace, Commander Saria Vel stood in the Strategic Planning Center aboard the Hegemony flagship Dominion, staring at a holographic display that showed the current state of the war. Red zones marked areas of human resistance. Blue indicated Hegemony-controlled territory. The scattered yellow dots represented neutral systems caught between two expanding spheres of influence, their populations waiting to see which side would determine their future. It should have been a familiar sight. The same kind of tactical overview she'd analyzed hundreds of times throughout her career. Clean lines of force projections, supply chain logistics, strategic objectives marked with clinical precision. But now looking at the display, all Saria could see were the people. 7 billion humans in the red zones, 12 billion hegemony citizens in the blue, and nearly 1 billion sentients in those yellow neutral systems trying to live their lives, while two galactic powers decided whether their worlds were worth fighting over. Each dot represented families, children, people with hopes and fears and connections that couldn't be calculated on any strategic assessment. People like Calvin Monroe, who measured success not by territory controlled, but by lives protected. Commander, General Thane materialized beside her with the silent authority that marked all high-ranking hegemony officers. The Admiralty is ready for your strategic assessment of human military capabilities. Saria nodded without taking her eyes off the display. What's the current strategic objective? Complete pacification of human resistance within 18 months. The High Council wants this conflict resolved before it destabilizes our other territorial holdings. 18 months. Such a clean timeline. Such an efficient approach to ending a war that had already cost millions of lives on both sides. And the preferred methodology, General Thane's expression remained neutral, but Saria caught the slight shift in his posture that indicated satisfaction with her question. Psychological warfare. Break their will to resist by targeting their emotional vulnerabilities. Your research on Project Convergence provides the foundation for a comprehensive campaign designed to exploit human attachment to civilian populations. There it was. the real reason she'd been recalled from Nexus Station. Not to assess human tactical capabilities, but to weaponize everything she learned about human psychology during her months with Cal. The plan involves systematic targeting of human civilian installations, Thane continued. Medical facilities, educational institutions, cultural centers. Nothing that provides direct military advantage, but everything that humans consider worth protecting. Saria felt something cold settle in her stomach as she began to understand the scope of what they were proposing. You want to force them to choose between strategic positions and civilian casualties. Exactly. Human military doctrine prioritizes protection of non-combatants, even at significant tactical cost. By threatening civilian targets, we can force their military into disadvantageous positions, drain their resources through constant rescue operations, and ultimately break their psychological resistance. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant in its understanding of human psychology and its exploitation of their greatest strength. It was also monstrous. General, how many civilian casualties are we projecting? Thane consulted his data pad with the casual efficiency of someone reviewing supply requisitions. Acceptable losses are estimated at 15 to 20 million. The psychological impact should force human surrender before casualties reach the upper end of that range. 15 to 20 million people. 15 to 20 million families destroyed. 15 to 20 million personal tragedies that would be reduced to statistical analysis in post-war assessments. 15 to 20 million Emma Monroes dying not because they posed a military threat, but because they represented something worth caring about. Commander Thane was watching her with the patience of someone accustomed to subordinates, taking time to process complex strategic information. Do you have concerns about the operational parameters? Saria looked back at the holographic display, at the clean lines of territorial control, and the efficient allocation of military resources, at the kind of strategic thinking that had made her reputation as the architect, at a plan that would work exactly as designed. General, I've been thinking about Project Convergence, about what I learned from my interaction with Captain Monroe. Excellent. Your insights into human psychological vulnerabilities will be crucial for implementation. Actually, that's not what I learned. Thane's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his professional composure. I don't understand. Saria moved to the holographic controls, calling up new data overlays that she'd been working on for the past 6 weeks. Not tactical assessments or strategic projections, but demographic analyses and cultural studies and economic interdependency reports. Look at the neutral systems, she said, highlighting the yellow zones in the display. 47 different species, hundreds of distinct cultural groups, all of them watching this conflict and trying to decide which side represents their best hope for survival. Thane studied the new data with the careful attention of a professional military analyst. What's your point, Commander? My point is that winning this war isn't just about defeating human military forces. It's about what kind of galactic civilization we build afterward. Saria pulled up economic projections, trade route analyses, resource distribution studies. If we win through systematic civilian targeting, what message does that send to those neutral systems? She watched Thane process the implications, seeing the moment when strategic calculation began to override bloodthirsty efficiency. They'll see us as conquerors rather than liberators, he said slowly. Exactly. And conquered populations require permanent occupation forces, continuous surveillance, constant military expenditure to maintain control. The numbers were stark, undeniable. But allied populations contribute to economic growth, technological development, cultural exchange. Saria called up another set of projections, these based on historical precedent from successful integration campaigns. General, what if instead of breaking human psychological resistance, we redirected it? Explain. Humans don't fight hardest when they're afraid. They fight hardest when they're protecting something they believe in. Saria highlighted human defensive actions from the past 2 years of conflict. But they're also remarkably pragmatic when presented with alternatives that serve their core values. She pulled up Cal's tactical assessments from their joint training exercises, his innovative approaches to conflict resolution that prioritize protection over dominance. Captain Monroe taught me something important about human psychology. They don't surrender when you prove you can hurt them. They surrender when you prove you don't want to. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of strategic reassessment. You're proposing a completely different approach to ending this conflict, Thane said finally. I'm proposing we win by being the kind of civilization that people want to join rather than the kind they fear. Sarya met his eyes directly. I'm proposing we trust that humans are capable of making rational choices when presented with honorable alternatives. It was a radical concept, almost alien in its approach to interspecies relations. It was also the kind of thinking that had made Calvin Monroe impossible to break, impossible to manipulate, and impossible to forget. Thane was quiet for a long moment, studying the strategic projections that painted a very different picture of post-war galactic civilization. The Admiralty will want concrete proposals, specific protocols, measurable objectives. Then I'll give them exactly that. Sarya turned back to the holographic display, but now instead of seeing territorial control, she saw possibilities. A comprehensive plan for ending this conflict through negotiated integration rather than military dominance. Huninam, and if it doesn't work, if human resistance continues, despite offers of honorable surrender, Sarya thought about Cal's sister dying in a medical center because someone had decided that civilian casualties were acceptable losses in the pursuit of strategic objectives. Thought about Cal himself choosing to risk his life for a group of researchers he'd never met simply because it was the right thing to do. Thought about the man who trusted her with his stories and his respect and his unwavering faith that people were capable of being better than their worst impulses. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, she said unconsciously, echoing words she'd heard in a hydroponics base 6 weeks ago. But we'll deal with it as the kind of people who tried to do the right thing first. General Thane studied her for a long moment, probably trying to determine whether she'd been psychologically compromised by her extended contact with human personnel. He wasn't wrong. I'll present your proposal to the Admiralty, he said finally. But Commander, this approach represents a significant deviation from established hegemony doctrine. Yes, sir, it does. And you're confident that it offers a better path to long-term strategic success? Sarya looked one more time at the holographic display, at the clean lines of military control and the messy complexity of actual galactic civilization, at a future that could be built on trust rather than fear. General, 6 months ago, I would have told you that trust was a weakness to be exploited, that emotional attachment was a vulnerability that could be weaponized against our enemies. She paused, remembering a conversation in an observation lounge about the weight of difficult choices. But I learned something important during Project Convergence. What's that? That the strongest people aren't the ones who can't be broken. They're the ones who choose not to break others, even when they have the power to do it. She turned away from the holographic display, leaving behind the clean certainty of tactical dominance for the messy uncertainty of doing the right thing. And sometimes, General, the most strategic choice is the one that lets everyone sleep at night. As she walked through the corridors of the flagship toward her quarters, Commander Sarya Vel carried with her the weight of a decision that would reshape the course of galactic history. A decision based not on calculated strategic advantage, but on faith in the possibility that different species could choose to build something better together than they could destroy apart. It was a gamble that would have horrified her 6 months ago. But then again, 6 months ago, she'd never met someone who taught her that the most important victories were the ones that didn't require anyone to lose. Somewhere in the depths of space aboard a human vessel carrying classified reports about interspecies cooperation, Captain Calvin Monroe would never know that his example had changed the course of a war. But in the strategic planning centers of the hegemony fleet, a new kind of thinking was taking root. The kind that measured success not by enemies defeated, but by allies gained. The kind that understood that the strongest foundations for lasting peace were built on mutual respect rather than mutual destruction. The kind that recognized that some things, some principles, some hopes for the future were worth protecting rather than exploiting. In the end, Commander Sarya Vel had learned the most important lesson of all, that the best traps are the ones you spring on yourself. What started as a mission to expose human weakness ended up revealing the true power of connection. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where nobody has to lose. If you enjoyed this story about humanity's unexpected strength, hit that subscribe button for for more sci-fi tales that will challenge everything you think you know about what makes us human. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.